Fault Lines.
We are back. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan. If you miss an episode, you can check us out in the popular podcast format on Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, the Apple Podcast app, and any place great podcasts are curated. Joining us now, Caleb Maupin, journalist, he correspondent for RT. Hey, Caleb, how you doing this morning?
I'm great. How about yourself? What's new?
I'm fantastic. I'm in love, and the whole world's terrific. And let me start, Caleb, with the.
How about this? I'm miserable. I can't figure out how to use Google Chats.
Yeah. See, that's the advantage of being in
miserable.
love. The whole world's terrific. That's what I like about that. But Caleb, let me ask you the question everybody's talking about. China, there's 1 trillion people. You need to be off the air. You know what I'm talking about, right, Caleb?
China?
No, right. See, it made no sense. Okay, go on. It's not just us. Caleb doesn't understand it either. We just had a caller who was incoherent. So I'm mocking him because that helps. But Caleb, let's talk about China for a second. The thing Garland controversially brought up this morning is that there's like 50 new cases of COVID in China, and China is taking it seriously, whereas we had like over 2,000 hospitalizations in Texas over the weekend. How do you see, you look at this, you're is it fair to call you a China-phile, Caleb?
Well, I follow it closely, and it sounds like, they're having new cases in various cities, and so they're locking down. They're taking it seriously. They've got a centralized one-size-fits-all approach, whereas with us, every state is doing their own thing. Trump has said 50 states do it 50 different ways, and we have a very, very different approach, and it's very confusing. I will say it's interesting that New York City is actually doing better in terms of it not expanding than anywhere else. It used to be we were the worst hit, but it seems like we've been taking it so badly here in New York that we actually have it more under control. But there's new cases, so China is taking precautions.
Well, Caleb, one of the things that I said a while back, and let me get your comment on this. A lot of the U.S. said we had a lockdown, but to me, what I saw in Wuhan was a lockdown, because when it hit in Wuhan, nobody moved. The bridges shut down. If you were there visiting your aunt, I'm sorry, you ain't going back home. The buses didn't move. The bridges, I mean, they literally like kind of encircled that like province, and nobody left and nobody came out. That was a lockdown, but they also, everybody had food and everything, had things they needed to survive. Where the U.S., we called it a lockdown. But if you went out on the streets half the time, there was literally a rush hour near me. There were so many people working in so many different things that were open that there was literally still a rush hour. And I thought to myself, well, what they did was a lockdown. What we did really never was a lockdown, because I knew so many people that were still going to work every day. Caleb.
Well, indeed. And I noticed that while China was taking the big dramatic measures they took back in January, our media proceeded to call them totalitarian and authoritarian, to criticize them for it. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump tweeted out that President Xi Jinping was doing a great job. Everyone seemed to be just, shocked, and how dare they do this. Meanwhile, President Trump was praising it. But now, when we got hit, the tone changed a whole lot really, really quickly. But I think it's important to note they got it before anybody else, right? I mean, they didn't have time to study how other countries handled it. They had to do it all on their own and take dramatic moves and take action based on it not being anywhere else yet. They didn't have other countries to study. Yet they managed to get it under control, and now it appears that it has returned, so they're once again taking action. Meanwhile, here in the United States, we had plenty of time to prepare for it. Our politicians were reassuring us that everything was going to be all right. Meanwhile, in the back room, they were selling their stocks and betting against us being able to handle it, and here we are.
Yeah, it was kind of a very Wall Streety thing kind of do, to hedge your stocks either way. Oh, they hedge their stocks on us losing. Something I wanted to ask you about, an article, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but apparently the EU's foreign policy chief a guy named Joseph Borrell, has basically said that the EU is not going to have a transatlantic alliance against China with the U.S. And he said that he called for a big positive agenda for EU-China cooperation, that the EU would not pick a side in the U.S.-China conflict. I kind of saw that coming for this reason. Okay, the U.S. has 330 million people. China has over 1 billion. If you force, like the EU, they make cars and stuff, okay? If you force me and I have to choose between two markets, and one of them's 300 million and the other's over 1 billion, I'm probably going to choose the one over 1 billion. Have you heard about this? And and if so, what are your thoughts on what's going on there, Caleb?
It fits perfectly. Let's remember that during the Obama years, Europe and the United States were quite close. The EU and Washington, D.C. kind of marched in lockstep. But the Trump administration represented distance between the United States and the European Union. Then we've seen, in the last couple of years, we've seen European countries that are part of the European Union getting friendlier to China, signing on with the Belt and Road Initiative, Italy, Poland, other countries. There's been, an establishing of closer relations between EU countries and China while there's been a trade war in the United States. And we've seen the relations with Europe and China expanding. What I thought was interesting was the Vatican and China have gotten closer. For a long time, the Vatican did not recognize the official, Communist Party recognized wing of the Catholic Church in China, but that changed, and the Vatican actually recognized the pro-Communist Party churches on the Chinese mainland. And there's talk of very soon the Vatican actually having diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. So as Europe gets closer to China, the United States gets more distant. But this fits what Steve Bannon and others would really like, right? I mean, this fits that whole America First, non-globalist approach. Obama was all about NATO. Obama was all about working with Europe. His idea was that we should be focusing on Russia. Well, the Trump administration seems to be about distance between the United States and NATO, make them pay for more weapons, make them, pay for more stuff, have a little bit of distance, and focus on China as being the one that we should put our international pressure on. So this fits a pattern. I'm not really surprised by it.
Well, yeah, and it's not, I say this all the time. Look, people are not aware of how they get propagandized. People think that they have ideas, and people think, and as you see this on the right, they think that, well, I'm concerned about China. Well, and they never questioned why that was. You brought up my old boss, Steve Bannon. Steve has absolutely been on this for a while, since he came into the Trump administration. And it's interesting because Steve Bannon, I know there's money involved in the back end somewhere. Somewhere he's making money on this. And he made a film about China and everything else. But at CPAC this year, the big conservative convention, anti-China was literally every place. It was in the talks. I went to the talks. It was all over. It was very, very, very clear what was going on. Now, Caleb, before you move off China, let me ask you one question. We had a guest on. We were talking about the trade routes with China, the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm still not clear. Can someone explain what's the belt in Belt and Road? I don't quite get that. I still don't get it. Is it a belt like you wear? I just don't understand it. I know I'm stupid. What am I missing?
It doesn't translate very well. But the idea is that countries will be interconnected with each other and operate on the basis of win-win cooperation. China, through its Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, in which other countries have joined in, will be funding projects to build things like airports and railroads and hospitals and the kind of things that are the lifeblood of an economy. These countries will flourish through their joining of the project, the building of things. They will flourish. They will then use the money to pay into the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank that will then build these things in other countries. That's kind of the idea. But yeah, Belt and Road doesn't really translate very, very well. For a while, they were talking about the new Silk Road, and they, hearkening back to the Marco Polo trade routes and, and the Silk Road. But Belt and Road, yeah, it doesn't translate very well into English, but that's the idea: is win-win cooperation.
Does it mean
building infrastructure?
Is it like Beltway? Is that what they mean?
I really can't tell you because it doesn't translate very well.
See, some things translate so well, Garland, like mother and child reunion. Have you seen that on the Chinese menu?
No.
Do you know what mother and child reunion is?
It's a 60s song, a 1960s song?
It is, but do you know what it comes from? It's a dish with the chicken and eggs in it.
Ah, ha, ha, that makes sense.
Yes, in a way.
I do have a question, one more China question from an ignorant person when it comes to China, and that is, maybe you can explain this to me, Caleb. When I think of the old red China and I don't know if it was propaganda or it wasn't, but when we were told that China was, this was like some kind of an authoritarian, I just thought of like a billion people all like wearing gray, marching in the same direction, no color. Everything was in black and white. They were just so evil, they didn't even have color. That's what I thought, right? What is the difference between the China that we were told, if it even existed, of the 60s and 70s, the more, the old red China, and what we see now that is some kind of a mixed economy that is kind of more a world power and kind of intermingled economically? What is different about China, and how did that change?
Well, I think the biggest difference is billions and billions of dollars. The China of the 1960s and 70s that was very authoritarian and was very much in opposition to the Soviet Union, was saying that the Soviet Union had sold out world communism, was arguing that they were the true interpreters. They would have pictures of Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, and it was like they were holding on to Stalin's vision while the Soviet Union had sold it out, supposedly with Khrushchev. In that China, a lot of the countryside hadn't really seen a revolution. They didn't have electricity, they didn't have running water, and China had basic industries that had been built during the 1950s and 60s, but they didn't really bring electricity or running water or all the modern development to much of the country. Most of the country was rural and underdeveloped in that China. What changed with 1978 and the reform and opening up was that there was a dramatic effort to bring economic development to the entire country, even if that meant having free market methods in some places. And we talked about the special economic zones that were set up. And the idea was, as Deng Xiaoping said, that poverty is not socialism, but to get rich is glorious, and that China could only move ahead with its vision of building a socialist society if it had vast economic prosperity. That, communism isn't dividing everything up equally so that everyone's equally poor. The idea of communism is that the state controls the means of production, that the economy is rationally planned, so growth is maximized, and that prosperity is spread around, and you can get closer toward that ultimate, goal of Marxism, that stateless, classless world. That requires vast material abundance.
Well, Caleb, if you could stand by, we're just about out of time for this segment, but we'll come right back. We do want to ask you a couple other things. We're going to touch base on CHAZ and some other things that we want to get your thoughts on. We're talking with speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst Caleb Maupin. We'll be right back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan. We're on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM in Washington, D.C. and KCXL in Kansas City and all over the internet. You can go to @Stranahan to check out the really fantastic Periscope feed with all kinds of cool graphics. Of course, you can go to our Facebook page. Don't forget, go to the Sputnik News Agency's Facebook page. Like that, you can watch us on Facebook live there, and we are on Twitter, Fault Lines Radio on Twitter. We're talking with speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, author Caleb Maupin. Caleb, I did want to touch base on this because I must say it's something that I'm ignorant about, haven't really had a lot of interest in, and to me, I got to be honest with you, it seems, I guess I don't know about it, a little silly, but the whole CHAZ thing going on in Seattle, I look at it and I'm like, what does that mean? Where do we go? What does that accomplish? How's that going to change society there, taking over 6 blocks or something? I mean, but at any rate, maybe I'm just ignorant about it. CHAZ, what's up with that, Caleb? And what are your thoughts on it?
You haven't watched Fox News? I mean, the Soviet Union was recreated in the middle of Seattle, and we're on the brink of communist revolution, and the Democrats are allowing it to happen. I mean, haven't you heard? I'm just kidding. But no, I mean, it seems like some anarchist hipster folks have established kind of a political space. We know that police precinct was vacated. The local government pulled the police out of there after some of the confrontations that happened. I'm certainly not on the ground there, but I have been in touch with people who are, because I'm following it very closely. And it seems that, they've set up kind of an activist movement space. It's mainly anarchist politics that seem to dominate it. They've got a vigil, going on in commemoration of George Floyd and the protesters who've been killed over the course of the demonstrations that we've seen over the past few weeks. They've also established, I know there's punk bands that are playing there, and it's just kind of an activist-y space out there in Washington. But some of what we're hearing about it is just completely wrong. I know at first they were saying that a rapper had taken it over. And it was controlled by this rap artist or something. That was turned out to be fake. They were trying to say that it was an authoritarian, liberal police state where everyone was required to have IDs. Well, that turned out to be fake. And there's just a lot of confused reporting and fake news out there. But I had the opportunity to interview actually somebody who was a member of the security team, a guy named Sam Shipman. He got on YouTube. We did a great exchange over Skype and talked about the fact that it's kind of like Occupy Wall Street. What makes it different, though, is that there's kind of some armed volunteer security guards there, because they had an incident where there was a protest going on. Somebody got out of their car and shot at some protesters. So these protesters have said, hey, if the right wing can use their Second Amendment rights, so can we. And there seems to be some armed patrolling of that area, which is certainly different from Occupy Wall Street. There was certainly no armed patrols at Occupy Wall Street. But they say, they say that they just want to protect themselves. What's weird is that Donald Trump has made such a big deal out of this and used this to attack the local government that now I think this has potential to stay intact for a long time as a dig at Trump. The local government is going to tolerate this a lot more because they are now, facing off with Donald Trump, who's using it to ridicule them. That's what I think is interesting about it.
So what about the people who had businesses there that have now been painted over and stuff like that? You're right. There were no I went to Zuccotti a few times. There were no armed guards, but what there were a lot of rapes. There were a lot of people who were in those camps there who were raped because there was no security at Occupy. And that was, again, that's not a guess. That was told to me by people at Occupy. And after I did reporting on that, they started to make some safe spaces. But you're right, there was no security. But I'm concerned, if it's power to the people, what about the people in that 6-block radius who had businesses, who what about their rights? I understand why. I think the fact that this is being applauded by people. If you want to go play like you've got your little government, it was fun. When I was 6, I used to make forts and stuff like that and pretend I had a country. And so it's fun to lose and pretend. But when I see these people taking over 6 blocks, I think of the people who they have displaced. This is not their property. This is not their area. They can declare it as such. and the governor and the mayor can go right along with it, but they're screwing the citizens who want to be in that area, who were in that area, and they've taken it over. And it's extortion, what they're doing. And again, it is just, to me, a disaster where you can look at it, go, oh, look, they're dancing and they're having concerts and everything else. It's not their property, which means it's somebody else's property. And by the way, they're not displacing Bill Gates or billionaires or Jeff Bezos. They're fine. They don't live in Capitol Hill. But what about the people who live in that area who don't want what's happening?
Well, that's the wild thing about this. I mean, you would think that this would have been over in 1 day or 2 days, but then Donald Trump opened his mouth and announced that this was a vast, terrorist conspiracy and attacked the local government in Seattle and made this into something that's been lasting for quite a bit now. And I'm kind of shocked when I look on it. I mean, this is the kind of thing that probably would have de-escalated and ended very quickly, but then it was turned into this political issue, and the internet has filled with all these rumors, and it's like a dual reality. I mean, I've seen the video of what's actually happening on the ground. I've interviewed people about what's actually happening on the ground, and then I turn on Fox News and I hear these fantastical over-the-top reports, and I mean, it seems to me that we're now seeing the local government is negotiating with them. We're negotiating with the local people, and people say it harkens back to the People's Park Rebellion. We know there was a park in Berkeley. The hippies and the left-wing folks took over, during the summer of 1969, I believe, and the National Guard moved in and kicked them out of there. And then they would go back and take it over again, and the National Guard and the police would come in. And eventually they incorporated it into the actual city of Berkeley. And now they have like a board of people who run it, and it's part of the official city government, and they kind of negotiated it in there. And it's kind of this weird tendency of like public space, private space. I mean, the main thing is not, somebody's business. The main thing is a police precinct that was vacated on orders from the city government. They said, pull the police out of there. They pulled out of this police precinct. The activists went in there and took it over. And from what I understand, it's in an apartment building, and a lot of the people who live in that apartment building have made clear they want their apartments, leave us alone, don't mess with it. And it's just this part of the apartment building, and it's a few blocks around there. From what I understand, they do have these barricades up to keep anyone from driving their car into it. But at the same time, a lot of people from off the street just kind of walk in and out of it all the time. And that's been one of the problems that they've had, is that there have been like wild, crazy people just kind of walking in and showing up and doing crazy stuff. And that it is kind of like Occupy Wall Street in the sense that there is no central leadership. There are no official orders being given. It is just kind of anybody can show up and do their own thing. It's the kind of thing that a lot of anarchists really dream of, but it's certainly not the Soviet Union recreated in downtown Seattle.
Well, the other thing about it is I look at it and I say there's a sad state of affairs. It reflects a sad state of affairs in our politics today. Because I kind of look at it and I'm like, I'll just be blunt. A flock of morons to me who have decided hey, we've taken over a bunch of blocks and look, that means something. I don't even know what. And as Lee said, I agree. People live there. People have businesses. People want to do whatever they want to do. That ain't yours. It's kind of theirs, right? And they're paying rent and mortgages and stuff like that. Okay. But that happens. And in reality, in my opinion, when people are going to get angry with me for that, I think the city should throw them out and say, it ain't yours. You can't just take over 6 blocks of a city. Who do you think you are? The U.S. government taking over a portion of Syria and stealing the oil? We don't do that here. We're a little more civilized, right? But then you get to me, the idiot resistance. As soon as Donald Trump says, I oppose it, well, there we go. We're in favor of this 100%. And then you got Fox News. As soon as they see that, oh, there's a political football, there's the commies, the Reds are overthrowing everything, when all you got is a small group of people doing something very, very foolish. And now you take these political entities and they snowball it into this giant political thing that to me should be no more than the local government saying, hey, you can't take somebody else's stuff. You don't live here. You don't have a business here. You can't take it over. No, it ain't your 6 blocks. It's somebody else. But all of the political football crap turns this into something far bigger than it really should be. Caleb, am I wrong here?
Well, yeah. Let me just add before you comment on that, Caleb. Adding to what Garland said, I like weird. I like Burning Man. Just don't put it in the middle of somebody else's property in the city when they got lives to live. Like I say, I get that. Go to Burning Man. Go out in the playa. Go do that there.
How about a farm?
Yeah.
What is that? Something
farm.
Bohemian Grove. They ain't doing nothing right there. Rent that out from them.
Oh, yeah.
They even got a giant owl statue or something.
I'm not sure Bohemian Grove would be perfect. Caleb, go ahead. We're crushing the dreams of these rebel anarchists. Go ahead, bring them back to life.
Well, I think the primary concern is that we don't want anyone to be hurt. That this doesn't need to turn into like an urban Waco or the move bombing or something like that. That we can hope that local officials there are able to negotiate with the people there and end this in a way that is peaceful and which nobody gets killed or violently hurt. And the tone on the internet and the tone from a lot of the right wing is just a call to go in there and murder everybody. And I think that anyone who's sensible doesn't want that to happen and wants this to be kind of resolved in a way that doesn't blow up into something really ugly. That's the primary thing. But I think people fit it in, the sit-down strike wave. Let's remember that. 1937, Roosevelt backed the labor movement. Sit down, occupy your factory. And had all these, and all across the country, the labor unions, they workers went out and they seized their factories. They sat down, they occupied their factories for their union rights. And the president of the United States said they had the right to do it because they had a property right to their job. And the Roosevelt administration backed the Communist Party and these radical groups occupying their factories and engaging in sit-down strikes, seizing factories and workplaces. And as a result of that, we have things like Social Security and unemployment insurance and union contracts for industrial workers. So seizing spaces as an act of protest, this happens. There's a whole history of that. You can talk about the lunch counter sit-ins during the civil rights movement where they would go and sit in a restaurant that would refuse to serve people of different races and sit there and refuse to leave and refuse to leave and refuse to leave until the police dragged them away. Seizing public spaces, seizing workplaces and stuff, there's a history of that as acts of protest. I think these anarchist folks, I'm certainly no anarchist, and I wouldn't have advised them to do this at all. I think they fit what they're doing in with that history of they see this as an act of civil disobedience. They see this as part of, coming out of Occupy, the seizing of public spaces, people moving in and such. I think that's what they think this is, and let's hope that this can be resolved in a way that no one is badly hurt. That's my concern. I look at this, and I really don't want this to end in a bad way.
Well, but it's already bad. The fact that you're saying they're negotiating, that's what you do with people who've taken hostages. And that's what they've done. They've taken the people who live and work in this area, who have businesses, and they've held them hostage. And they've vandalized it, and they're extortionists. So at this point, like I say, I have not heard anybody suggest everybody there be murdered. I've not heard that. However, what do you do when you have a group of people that's growing, and the mayor could not be more enthusiastic about this? The mayor is not saying, hey, we're trying to negotiate. The mayor thinks it's an awesome party, which, like I say, I've been to Zuccotti. In some ways,
Lee, don't you think that's just that anti-Trumpism stuff? Don't you think a lot of that is just that Trump said, hey, I oppose it, and they're like, oh, well, great, we're for it 100%.
Nope, I don't. I think she's a committed leftist, and she romanticizes this idea of occupying space. As Caleb was talking about, there is a history, but I'll point out that people in the civil rights movement didn't move into the lunch counter. They did not take over the restaurant and set up a little village.
Well, here's the other part that's important.
We're almost out of time, though.
Oh, okay, well, and that is, whether it's the workers and during the Roosevelt, the lunch counter, they actually wanted something. You know what I mean? They're like, hey, we want X. And the anarchists never want anything, just to hang out in the space. How can you negotiate with someone when they're not even asking for anything?
Yeah, Caleb, we'll only have a minute here. You get the last word. Go ahead.
Indeed.
30 seconds.
It's a group of activists. They're doing their thing, and I think it would have been ended very quickly if it weren't for Donald Trump opening his mouth and throwing it into it. And we're just going to have to see how it plays out. As far as the extortion thing, though, I've seen that has been debunked. They're not running a protection racket. That was a false claim that was floating around. I've seen that's not really the case.
Well, you put a metaphor on it however you want to, but that's effective. When you're having to negotiate for people to get their own freaking neighborhood back, I don't know what else to call it. But Caleb Maupin, thanks so much. Always great to have you on the show. Stay safe up there in New York. We got more coming up. 2 more hours this morning, the best morning radio show in America, bringing you more sides. It's Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.